Now, to get to the number one reason why you may be doing really well in one area of your life and not the other, after you have all these tools, you have all this knowledge, you're like, I'm a self-help guru, I know all these things, but I really struggle in my relationships, or I really struggle with just being able to let go and have fun, or I really struggle with integrating my spiritual connection into my entire life. It's sort of like you leave that for retreats, or you leave that for in the closet. Like you don't allow this to be integrated into who you really are and living that every day. Or you're way up here where you're doing really awesome financially in your business, but you're sucking in the other areas of your life and you're frustrated. Like, what the hell is happening? Well, this is why. Okay, so before we dive into the number one reason why you struggle to do really well in all areas of your life and you find yourself doing really well, maybe just killing it in one, you've had an awakening, you know you create your reality, you believe in the law of attraction, you've been able to manifest things in your life. However, there's one area where you really, really struggle in. Before I tell you the number one reason why that is, I want to give you a little bit of background on what we call the Quadrant Theory. Now, the Quadrant Theory is a framework my husband and I developed after lots of our own personal growth, self-help journey, after helping hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people through that process as well, and seeing certain patterns, not only in our own growth journey, but in those people that we helped. I'm really good at seeing patterns in things. And there was, of course, patterns that I was seeing in my own growth in different areas of my life. But I was also seeing those same patterns play out in the clients that we worked with and the students that came into our classes. And after many, many, many years of going through this process, like I said, internally and taking others through those, I was able to map those patterns neurologically, actually using our brain. Now, before we dive into the answer as to why you may be killing it in one area of your life, not in another, I want to give you a little bit of background on the Quadrant Theory. Now, the Quadrant Theory is our signature framework that we developed, my husband and I, after seeing patterns of how our own personal growth and spiritual development journey went, and then helping hundreds and hundreds of other people through that same process. It seemed to be that there was a split or there was imbalance. People would have an awakening, they'd figure out the law of attraction, they'd go way to the other extreme, and they wouldn't want to live in their life. They'd want to leave their jobs, leave their relationships. My husband and I know because we went through that process. It's almost like you become spiritually entitled and you don't want anything to do with the regular human world. A lot of times you can become very judgmental because you're like, I don't want to have anything to do with that human stuff, or you need to all awaken. And it sort of can form this spiritual ego, which, by the way, is a normal part of the process. But we saw people go to that extreme, or they would go into this place where it's like they didn't want any responsibility. This is what I went through. I didn't want any responsibility. I didn't want to do anything. I just wanted to have fun. I wanted to be with people. I had a huge open heart, and we were with people all the time. We were in community. And I loved that, but it was like, I couldn't even do the dishes. I didn't even want to do the dishes or laundry. Like I didn't even enjoy the everyday things of being a human being. And so I saw that in my own journey, but then I saw that in other people that we were helping, or they'd have a spiritual awakening, but then they'd still get caught in their business. Most of them were entrepreneurs or in corporate America where they're like high up on the corporate ladder with really intense jobs. And so they're doing really well financially, but they would go to an extreme in that. I've been there as well. Or they would go into the extreme of what we call the shadow of quadrant 2, which is like deep in the drudgery of healing, trauma healing. I need to heal this, I need to heal that, which we realized is fundamental to the process. However, the pattern was that people were getting stuck in these areas. It was like they were going to these extremes in the journey, and then they couldn't figure out why they were stuck in that place. They couldn't get out of their trauma healing, or they couldn't get out of wanting to escape to the spiritual world. So we'd see people go to these meditation retreats over and over and over again. They'd have these profound transformative spiritual experiences, and then they'd go back home and change nothing. Or we'd see people go and do tons of ayahuasca and tons of healing things, and they would get stuck down in there. And it was like this constant imbalance. And really what we discovered through looking at all those patterns was this framework for what we call the Quadrant Theory. And what we came to understand is actually this is neuroscience, it's neurobiology actually. It's how your brain is set up to perceive your entire world. I follow a teacher by the name of Don Hoffman. He's actually a researcher and scientist, and he did an experiment with his students that proved there is 0% chance that if you believe in evolution by natural selection, which is the scientific basis for everything scientific, if you believe in that, there is 0% chance we see reality as it is. And his theory is that the brain is just like a headset, where actually our experience is just a headset. It's not real. It's not the real basis of reality, but it's like a VR headset basically. And I studied him and watched him a lot. I highly recommend him. It's very heady, so you may need to take some time to watch him. But that stuck with me. It goes along with a lot of deep spiritual teachings, which is like, this isn't the actual reality. This is more like a video game. However, it is real when you're in it. Because again, you can go to the other extreme of like, none of this matters, right? And so I came to understand that if we can really learn how to use the technology that we have to navigate this game, it can change everything in every area of your life. And by technology, I literally mean your brain. So looking at the neuroanatomy and the neurobiology of your brain. Now, I've taken tons of different courses in neuroscience. I'm a certified breathwork instructor, which was about a year training. And you learn really a lot about biology, and you learn a lot about the brain. I was an advanced student of Dr. Joe Dispenza's teachings. I went to 14 of his workshops. I was always really passionate about learning about the brain and how it is really, like I said, a technology to perceive and navigate our reality. Where I felt like there was a big gap was the world between the science, including the neuroscience, and the spiritual. But really, when we could marry those two things, it was as if it was the missing piece and everything really could make sense. And how I saw these patterns in people's journeys, in our own journeys, if you only look through a scientific or psychological lens, it would only give you half the answer. But if you brought in the spiritual, it would give you the full answer. And same with the other side. If you only looked at the spiritual, you'd be missing a lot of the information from the scientific and psychological side. But really, if we looked at it from a holistic perspective, it was like giving you the keys to your own freedom. And that's how my husband and I came up with this framework, the Quadrant Theory. And so to understand the Quadrant Theory, it's really simple. All you have to understand is the 4 quadrants of your brain. So if you think of your brain divided into 4 sections, and literally each of these sections are responsible for different chemicals, for different thoughts, beliefs, behaviors, for different experiences. They all have different access points, which means they're going to have different access points to areas of your life. So quadrant 1, you can think of as the ego, basically the person that you believe you are. It's where your courage lives. It's where your leadership lives, your analytical mind. Courage, leadership, analytical. So it's the part of you that's like the Tony Robbins, right? When you watch Tony Robbins, you're like, yeah, I'm going to go get it. That is quadrant 1. That is literally what this part of your brain is responsible for. Now, we go down into quadrant 2, which is the limbic system part of your brain. So think of this as the mental aspect, the thinking brain. So it's like when you're learning something new or you're analyzing data, you're trying to solve a problem, you're in the mental analytical space. Down here in the limbic system is the emotional part of your brain. So this is really where you store memories. This is also where, I'm sure you've heard the term, your subconscious beliefs. This is where your belief system is stored, your subconscious beliefs. So the beliefs that were imprinted into your brain in the first 7 years of your life, basically. So it's also where you give meaning to certain things, okay? But this is also your intuition. This is going to rule the relationships in your life. This is also where you can access empathy. So think of this as your inner child. I'm sure you've heard that since you've been in the world of self-help and spirituality. This is really where your inner child lives. If you think about, my husband and I always say that when a child comes in, they're actually the closest to God because they haven't had all the trauma, all the beliefs, all of the conditioning that we go through in our childhood. So they come in like a fresh slate. So we say they're the closest to God. That's why intuition and empathy really live in this quadrant of the brain, because you don't have all the conditioning that's clouding you yet. So that is literally biologically a part of your brain. So I always think it's kind of funny when people talk about, well, you don't need to worry about your inner child, or you don't need to do inner child healing. But actually this part of your brain never ages. So you can pretend that you don't need to do that, but that never ages. So that part of you is always there in your brain, which means there will be areas of your life that you are going to see through that inner child. And if you haven't worked on these beliefs and you haven't worked on your trauma and your shadows that exist in quadrant 2, you're going to struggle with the relationships in your life, because this quadrant rules relationships. Now, we come up here or over here to quadrant 3, and this is the part of your brain that's also the limbic system. So it's also the emotional aspect. However, the biggest difference, because this is the left side of your brain and this is the right side of your brain, the left side is the identity, the personality, the part of you that exists in the three-dimensional world. It's the voice that's always in your head, that's talking, that thinks it knows everything. That's basically the ego, the human self. Now over here, you can think of as your spiritual self. It's your soul or your higher self or your present self that exists in the right side of the brain. And the difference between 2 and 3 here is 2 is usually always in the past, most of the time, sometimes in the future, because you can use your quadrant 2 for imagination, which would be in the future. But a lot of times 1, when you're in quadrant 1, you're in the future, which is why when you're imbalanced in 1, you get really stressed out, anxiety, because you're worrying about the future. A lot of times if you go into like a depressive state, that's a classic sign and symptom of the shadow of quadrant 2, because you're focused on the past. The difference in quadrant 3 to quadrant 2 is that when you're balanced in quadrant 3, or you're accessing quadrant 3 of your brain, you're in the present. That's the difference between these two. This is the past, this is the present. And you can think of this aspect of you, it's the fire element. So think of yourself as the fiery child who is adventurous, who is risk-taking, who's like, I just want to have fun. I just want to play. Now in the shadow, that can get very fiery, right? So we don't ever want to go into the shadow of each of these quadrants. We want to be balanced. However, that's the side of you that like get up and dance in front of people and you don't care, right? Just like little children. This is also where a lot of love exists, is in quadrant 3. So you think of a young child, they're always wanting to play with their friends or wanting to be around people. They're very community oriented and they live from their hearts. So if you are activated in your quadrant 3, it's when you feel like you have an open heart, that you're not afraid, you don't live in fear. Fear does not exist in quadrant 3. In fact, the total opposite. What's the opposite of fear? Love. So when you're balanced in your quadrant 3, that aspect of you, you're going to be able to surrender. You're going to be able to trust. You're going to be able to play because you're not taking things so seriously, as opposed to the quadrant 1, the really serious adult. Quadrant 3 is the really playful child, okay? So this area of your life is going to govern that. It's going to govern your ability to play, to let loose, to relax, to release, to trust and surrender, and instead of trying to force and push. So it's the part of you that can, you complete a task up here in 1. 3 is like the part of you that totally lets it go. Like, I took action and I'm totally going to let it go. I'm going to trust and surrender that something bigger than me, that knows more than me, is going to figure that out. And I'm going to go play with my friends. That governs quadrant 3. A lot of times this also governs your physical health, because a lot of times in order to activate quadrant 3 and really be balanced in it, you're going to be doing something physical. You can think of 1 and 4 as the mental plane and 2 and 3 as the emotional plane, which means you're going to be more down in your body, because these are the emotional realms, and emotions live in your body, not in your mind, right? Thoughts live in your mind, emotions live in your body. Now, if we come up here to the last one, quadrant 4, this is also the mental plane, but this is the part of you that is the wise universal self. So you access wisdom up here, you access unity consciousness. You are one with everything up here. You are not separate, which is what can happen down here. You're one with everything. This is your deepest, deepest, deepest spiritual connection. This is like, you are God, you are the universe, you are part of everything. You see yourself in everything and everything in you. You feel connected to everybody. You see from a higher perspective. So of course, fear has no place over here because you see, it's like broadening or pulling out your perspective. You see more from a universal perspective. So you understand that you have compassion for people that are suffering, but you understand that is their soul's journey because, as I said, you see from a larger perspective. So this is, like I said, still in the mental plane. So if you know anything about the Hermetic principles, the first principle is all is mind. The universe is mental. And that really is accessing this quadrant 4. That's, like I said, your deepest spiritual connection. That is, states of altered consciousness when you're in meditation, if you've had these really profound experiences where you're totally immersed. This is also known as flow, in the flow cycle. So if you're totally immersed in something, whether that be meditation, this can also happen when you're writing or you're making music or you're building something and you're totally immersed in it. The reason why they call it flow states is because you completely lose awareness of the self, of what they call the default mode network, which lives over here in 1 and 2, the left side of the brain. That's the default mode network. That completely shuts off because you're totally immersed. You become one with whatever that you're doing. You are in a unity consciousness. So this is literally governs your spiritual connection. Now, to get to the number 1 reason why you may be doing really well in one area of your life and not the other, after you have all these tools, you have all this knowledge, you're like, I'm a self-help guru, I know all these things, but I really struggle in my relationships, or I really struggle with just being able to let go and have fun, or I really struggle with integrating my spiritual connection into my entire life. It's sort of like you leave that for retreats, or you leave that for in the closet, like you don't allow this to be integrated into who you really are and living that every day. Or you're way up here where you're doing really awesome financially in your business, but you're sucking in the other areas of your life and you're frustrated, like what the hell is happening? Well, this is why the quadrant theory is why the number 1 reason why you're struggling in one area but doing good in the other is because you're not accessing all 4 quadrants of your brain. So like I said, if you can think of quadrant 2 as governing relationships, if you have not done the work in your quadrant 2, which does include trauma healing, it does include shadow work, it does include working on your subconscious beliefs, then you are going to struggle in relationships. This is also the place, it's the feminine aspect of you. So it's the place that you are just there for your loved ones, as opposed to trying to fix them, as opposed to telling them what to do, which is the number 1 thing to do. You are just with them. You can just provide support and you can be okay in not fixing. You can be okay in the messiness of life. And that is relationships are. They're messy. They're convoluted. They can get really crazy. But when you learn to master this aspect and bring it in and balance it, that is going to improve every single relationship in your life, not to mention the biggest one, the relationship with yourself. These exist on 2 poles. 2 and 4 are interconnected and 1 and 3 are interconnected. So relationships, if you're not balanced in there, you become a martyr, you become needy, you become in the shadow of quadrant 2, which is either I don't care at all about relationships, so you're way up here on this end of the pole, you cannot connect with other people, you have a hard time creating relationships because you're way up here in the shadow of quadrant 4, which means you need to learn to come down and work within your quadrant 2 so that you can have really deep, meaningful, fulfilling relationships. And so that's where you really need to master. If you're working on relationships, you need to work on your quadrant 2. Now, let's say you've had a spiritual awakening and you're totally enjoying life. You're going to retreats maybe. You're getting a community of people. You're like, oh, I want to do this for a living. I want to help people for a living. Classic Quadrant 3. I really want to wake people up. I want to do all this. And yet you struggle financially. It's because you're way in the shadow of Quadrant 3. You're way down here, let's say down here, as opposed to really learning how to integrate Quadrant 1, which does include wealth and finances. That all exist in Quadrant 1. It also consists of leadership. It also consists of having to use your analytical mind. It also consists of courage and the ability to get outside your comfort zone. Down here is like all comfort in Quadrant 3. We're having fun, we're playing, we love it. But if you can't learn to balance and integrate your Quadrant 1, you're never gonna step out of your comfort zone. You're never gonna step into a role that is gonna allow you to actually help people, right? Because you need all of these skills and abilities of Quadrant 1. It's just that you have to stay balanced in that, okay? So if you find yourself really struggling in figuring out how to make money or figuring out how to live out your purpose or your passion or create wealth in your life, then you really need to work on your Quadrant 1 stuff and your beliefs. It's also working on your beliefs around each of these, right? If you have really limiting beliefs around relationships, you're going to struggle with balancing your Quadrant 2. If you have limiting beliefs around play and surrender, like they're just lazy and nobody should be doing that, you're going to struggle in your Quadrant 3. If you have beliefs around money or leadership or ego or things like that, then you're really going to struggle with being able to balance your Quadrant 1. If you think that Quadrant 4 is just for the hairy-fairy, doesn't really matter, you're definitely going to struggle with being able to connect with something more than you in your life. So you really have to, number one, look at your beliefs around each of these quadrants, because listen, you don't have to believe in the woo-woo. This is the biology of your brain. These are actual parts of your brain that govern your perception and therefore govern your entire reality. So if you're finding yourself working really hard and you can sometimes have these really profound spiritual experiences. Like I said, I saw a lot of these in a community we were in years ago, that people would go and have these profound experiences at these retreats and workshops, and then they would go home and they wouldn't integrate any of it. They'd go all the way back, way over here in the shadow of 1 or way down here in the shadow of 2, instead of learning to come closer to the middle so that you can live in balance between all 4. You're literally accessing all 4 parts of you. Now, I use Jungian psychology in our Quadrant Theory immersive class where we dive into this. And why that's important is because Carl Jung postulated that there are 12 total archetypes in our human experiences. And I was able to map all 12 of those archetypes under each of these quadrants as they describe different parts of ourselves. Now, he says these archetypes are things that we use as a whole of humanity in our movies, in our books, in our allegory, in our myths, in our legends, in all of these characters that we create within the entire human perspective, all fit with under these 12 archetypes, which means that we have access in our own brains to these archetypes to be able to access them all, to be able to access the warrior and the person that leads and the person that's courageous and the person that can look at data and analyze, the person that can use logic and reasoning without emotion driving them, right? But also the emotional part of us that can connect with others, that can sit across from somebody and say,